Did you know that one of the most celebrated acts of wartime generosity might have also been one of the most ruthless economic power plays in modern history? Most of us learned that America's act saved Britain from the brink of collapse in World War II. It was painted as a selfless act, the arsenal of democracy, helping a friend in need. But what if that's only half the story? What if, buried beneath the tailies of heroism and alliance, lies a different truth, a story of how Britain, while fighting for its survival, was quietly and systematically dismantled, not by its enemies, but by its closest ally. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the story hidden in plain sight, in declassified documents and the bitter memories of those who lived through it. A story of how America used the desperation of war to secure its own global dominance, ensuring that when the smoke cleared, there would be only one true superpower left standing. And the price: the British Empire itself. Let's set the scene. It's 1940. Britain stands alone against the might of the Nazi war machine. France has fallen, and the Luftwaffe is pounding British cities into dust. The country is bleeding money, weapons, and lives. Winston Churchill makes a desperate plea to the American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Britain needs everything: destroyers, planes, ammunition, food. But there's a problem. Britain is broke. The cash and carry policy, where Britain had to pay up front for all supplies, had drained its coffers dry. Enter Lend-Lease, signed into law in March 1941. The concept was beautifully simple, as Roosevelt described it with his famous garden hose analogy. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire. I don't say to him, "Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it." I don't want $15, I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. It sounded like a lifeline. No more cash payments. America would simply lend Britain the materials it needed to win the war. In return, Britain would repay the favor in kind after the conflict. What could be more reasonable? Well, the devil, as they say, is in the details, and the details of Lend-Lease were devastating. The first, and most immediate, cost was Britain's gold. Before Lend-Lease was even on the table, the United States insisted that Britain liquidate all its assets. We were talking about billions of dollars in gold reserves and American securities owned by British citizens and companies. These weren't just government funds. Private British citizens were forced to sell their American stocks to the British government, which then sold them to the U.S. to pay for weapons. The British economy was effectively stripped bare before the first Lent bullet arrived. This wasn't just about paying for goods. It was a strategic move. By emptying Britain's treasury, America ensured that Britain would be completely dependent on its aid for the rest of the war and for years to come. The British negotiator, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, called these terms financial Dunkirks. He understood that Britain was being forced into a position of total economic servitude. But the financial bleeding was just the beginning. The real masterstroke was Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement. It sounds innocent enough, calling for the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. But what did that actually mean? It was a direct assault on the system of imperial preference. This system was the economic glue holding the British Empire together. It was a trade agreement where countries within the empire, like Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa, gave each other preferential treatment with lower tariffs. This created a massive, self-contained trading bloc that competed directly with the United States. America had wanted to break into this exclusive market for decades. Now, with Britain desperate for survival, they had their chance. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to dismantle its own economic empire in exchange for wartime aid. It was a Faustian bargain. Churchill and his cabinet knew it. They fought against it, but they had no choice. It was either accept the terms or face potential defeat by Germany. The gun was at their head. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. While British industry was converted entirely to war production, American companies, fueled by the economic boom, were capturing global markets that had once been British strongholds. For example, under the Lend-Lease rules, Britain was forbidden from exporting any goods that contained Lend-Lease materials or were similar to goods being provided. This meant that while Britain was fighting for its life, its international trade, the lifeblood of its economy, came to a screeching halt. Latin America, a traditional British market, was quickly dominated by American corporations. The poet and politician Leo Amory lamented in his diary, "We are in the paradoxical position of being completely in the hands of the Americans for our very existence. While they are also our most formidable trade rivals and use our extremity to throttle our future." He wasn't wrong. Even during the war, American officials were openly talking about the post-war world, a world of free trade, dominated by the US dollar and American industry. The story gets even more bitter after the war ends. In August 1945, just 2 days after the surrender of Japan, President Truman abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. The fire, in Roosevelt's analogy, was out. And America didn't just want its garden hose back, it wanted payment. Immediately. Britain, which had sacrificed nearly a quarter of its national wealth to the war effort, was suddenly cut off. The country was exhausted. Its cities were in ruins, and its economy was shattered. The winter of 1946-47 was one of the harshest on record, with widespread power cuts and food rationing that was even stricter than during the war. To avoid total collapse, Britain was forced to take on another massive loan from the United States, the Anglo-American loan of $1,946. And attached to this loan were even stricter conditions. The main one, Britain had to make its currency, the pound sterling, fully convertible to US dollars within a year. This was the final nail in the coffin of the British Empire's economic system. When convertibility came into effect in 1947, there was a run on the pound. Everyone holding pounds wanted to convert them to the much stronger dollar. The British treasury was drained in a matter of weeks, and the country was plunged into an even deeper financial crisis. This economic pressure accelerated the breakup of the British Empire. Unable to afford the costs of maintaining its colonies and dependencies, and with its economic grip fatally weakened, Britain began the process of decolonization. India, the jewel in the crown, gained independence in 1947. Over the next 2 decades, the empire on which the sun never set was dismantled, piece by piece. Of course, there were many factors driving decolonization, including the rise of nationalist movements, but the economic devastation, engineered in large part by the terms of American aid, was a critical catalyst. America hadn't fired a shot at the British Empire, but it had won the war for global supremacy. The pound was replaced by the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The British Royal Navy, which had policed the world's oceans for a century, was supplanted by the US Navy. The New World Order, the American century, had begun. So, was Lend-Lease a generous act of an ally or a calculated act of economic warfare? The truth is, it was both. It undoubtedly provided the materials that helped Britain and the Soviet Union defeat Nazi Germany. Without it, the war could have been lost. But it was also a tool, wielded with surgical precision, to ensure that America would emerge from the war not just as a victor, but as the undisputed global hegemon. It was a classic example of disaster capitalism, using a crisis to rewrite the rules of the global economy. The old British lion was wounded, and the American eagle saw its opportunity. This isn't about blaming America or downplaying the heroism of the war. It's about understanding the complex, often brutal, realities of geopolitics that lie beneath the simple narratives we're taught in school. The world we live in today, a world of American economic, cultural, and military dominance, was not an accident. It was forged in the fires of World War II, shaped by shrewd decisions made in Washington while London burned. The cost of Britain's survival was its empire, and the price was paid in full. The year is 1940. Britain stands completely alone against the might of Nazi Germany. Night after night, the Luftwaffe turns London's skies orange with fire. Out in the cold, dark, Atlantic German U-boats hunt British ships like wolves, sinking convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons. The British Empire, a colossal entity that once spanned a quarter of the globe, is hemorrhaging money, bleeding gold with every single hour that passes deep beneath the streets of London, in a cramped, smoke-filled operations room in Whitehall. A man named Edmund Clark watches the numbers. He's a mid-ranking Treasury officer, just 35, but he looks much older. He's thin, tired, and has spent far too long living in the shadow of constant crises. Every day, the reports are the same, a relentless drumbeat of disaster. More ships sunk, more factories bombed into rubble, more gold, precious gold, loaded onto ships for the dangerous journey across the Atlantic to pay for American supplies. You see, Britain is fighting for its life. But survival has a price tag. Every ton of steel, every fighter plane, every single rifle arriving from the United States requires cash on delivery, and Britain is running out of cash. Fast. To pay the bills, the government has already been forced to sell off massive British investments in America. Entire businesses, built over generations, are being auctioned off at fire sale prices. It's a national liquidation sale, and the world's largest empire is on the verge of bankruptcy. One morning, as Edmund is poring over yet another grim ledger, he overhears his superiors talking. They speak in hushed, urgent tones, but the words cut through the low hum of the office like a dagger. "We'll be bankrupt by Christmas," one says. "Then we must go to Roosevelt again," another replies. A third man adds, his voice heavy with dread, "God help us if he refuses." That single phrase hangs in the air. Bankrupt by Christmas. The British Empire, the global superpower for over a century, has mere months before it runs out of money. The implications are terrifying. No more money means no more American weapons. No more weapons means defeat, and defeat means a Nazi flag flying over Parliament. The end of everything they know. That evening, Edmund walks home through a London that looks more like a ruin than a city. The air is thick with the smell of smoke and dust. He steps carefully around fresh bomb craters that scar the streets. Fires still smolder in the skeletons of what were once homes and shops. He passes a young woman, her face smudged with soot, clutching a baby wrapped in a dirty blanket. Her hair is white with dust from a collapsed building nearby. She looks up at Edmund, her eyes hollow, exhausted, and asks a simple, devastating question. "Will it end soon?" Edmund wants to say. Yes. He wants to promise her that help is on the way, that victory is certain. But he can't. He knows the numbers. He knows how close they are to the edge. All he can do is offer a weak, tired nod and continue his journey home. The woman's desperate question echoing in his mind. But while London is shrouded in darkness and despair, the picture across the ocean in Washington, D.C. is very, very different. President Franklin Roosevelt genuinely wants Britain to survive. He sees the UK as the last bastion of democracy against Hitler's tyranny. But his advisors, the shrewd, pragmatic men of Washington, see something else entirely. They see an opportunity, a once-in-a-century opportunity. They look at the British Empire not as an ally, but as a vast treasure chest. It holds the world's most valuable assets, exclusive shipping lanes, colonies rich in resources, captive markets for its goods, vast oil fields in the Middle East, and a global network of military bases. They understand that if Britain falls, Hitler gets all of it. Germany would become an unstoppable global superpower overnight. But they also calculate another possibility. What if Britain survives? What if it wins the war, but emerges from it broken, indebted, and utterly dependent on the United States? In that scenario, America could inherit the world. It could take control of those markets, those resources, those bases. It could become the new global superpower, all without firing a shot in Europe. The British Empire's crisis was America's golden ticket. And so, an idea begins to form, an idea that is both brilliant and ruthless. It's called Lend-Lease. On the surface, it sounds incredibly generous. President Roosevelt sells it to the American public with a simple analogy. He says, suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose. I don't say to him, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. I don't want $15, I want my garden hose back after the fire is over. It sounds like a neighborly helping hand, a law that looks like salvation for a desperate Britain. But hidden in the fine print, it was a legal and financial instrument designed to dismantle the British Empire, piece by piece. When the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, receives the details of the Lend-Lease proposal in a coded telegram, he feels an overwhelming wave of relief. It's a lifeline. The weapons will keep flowing. Britain will survive. He famously declares, "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." For Churchill, it is the moment that ensures victory. But back in the Treasury, when Edmund Clark reads the financial breakdown of the deal, he doesn't feel relief. He feels a cold, creeping dread. Because buried beneath the patriotic speeches and the talk of garden hoses are clauses that change everything. They are the true price of survival. Torah C. Batis, loan of American aid. Britain has to agree to a series of staggering conditions. First, it must hand over its remaining gold reserves to the United States for safekeeping. Second, the sell-off of British-owned companies to American buyers must continue, often at prices dictated by the buyers. Third, and this is the killer blow, Britain must agree to open up its exclusive imperial markets to American goods. This system, known as imperial preference, was the economic glue holding the empire. It ensured that colonies traded primarily with Britain. By abolishing it, America was kicking the door open to take over Britain's most profitable markets. But there's more. Britain must also grant the U.S. long-term leases on military bases in its colonies across the globe, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. And finally, the entire structure of the deal ensures that British industry will become dependent on American manufacturing for decades to come. Britain wasn't just getting a loan of equipment. It was signing away its economic sovereignty. Edmund, his hands trembling slightly as he holds the documents, goes to his superior, an older, world-weary man who has seen it all. In a quiet, urgent whisper, Edmund says, "Sir, this isn't a loan. This is an empire transfer." His superior looks at him, his eyes filled with a profound sadness and resignation. He takes a deep breath and sighs. "War forces choices. Clark," he says softly, "we have no other options. Right now, survival costs everything we have." Edmund walks out of the office, the weight of that truth settling upon him. Britain had just been presented with an impossible choice: surrender to Germany or surrender its empire to America. It chose the latter. To win the war, to save its present, Britain had just traded away its future. The torch of global power was being passed, not in a battlefield, but in the cold, hard language of a financial contract. The British Empire was saved from Hitler, only to be dismantled by its closest friend. By 1942, the shift was impossible to ignore. British ships, once the pride of a global empire, crossed the vast Atlantic Ocean completely empty. They had been stripped of their gold, stripped of their factories, stripped of anything and everything that was left to sell. In Washington, D.C., warehouses overflowed with British-owned assets, now being purchased for pennies on the dollar by an ascendant America. A British official named Edmund, part of a desperate Treasury delegation, had traveled to the United States, expecting to find a partner, an ally in the fight against tyranny. What he found instead felt more like a marketplace, or perhaps more accurately, a feeding frenzy. He witnessed a seemingly endless line of executives from American steel companies, oil corporations, shipping firms, and powerful banks. They all came with lists, long lists of British assets they wanted to buy, and the prices they offered. They were insults, fire sale bargains that took advantage of Britain's desperation. Edmund Argaden A. negatiated. He practically begged for fairer terms, but every meeting, every handshake, every tense discussion, and every smoke-filled room ended the same way. The message was brutally simple. You want weapons to fight? You want food for your people? You want ships to protect your convoys? Then sin on the dotted line. The leverage was absolute. One day, while touring a busy American port, Edmund's ears caught a fragment of a conversation between two American businessmen. They were laughing. "Britain won't have a thing left when this war is over," one of them chuckled. The other replied, "Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? A new order is coming." The first man added, "By the time Germany finally falls, the British Empire will belong to us." Hearing this, Edmund clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't aid. It was a hostile takeover, cloaked in the language of alliance. A quiet, bloodless conquest, and it wasn't just happening in Washington. Across Britain's sprawling empire, the ground was shifting beneath their feet. In India, factory owners who had supplied the British market for generations were suddenly told they must cease production for Britain and make way for American manufacturers. In Africa and across the Middle East, British colonial officials watched, helpless. As representatives from U.S. companies arrived, their briefcases filled with contracts directly backed by the power and money of Washington. The Union Jack might still fly from the flagpoles, But it was becoming increasingly clear that America was the one pulling the strings. Even Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the bulldog of Britain, felt a bite. In private, he complained bitterly to his confidants. "We are being skinned alive." But he knew, as Edmund knew, that he had no choice. Britain was backed into a corner. Without the Lend-Lease program, without the constant flow of American supplies, the nation would starve. The war effort would collapse. Surrender would become inevitable. In 1943, a letter arrived for Edmund from his wife back in London. Her words painted a grim picture of life on the home front: the constant food shortages, the terrifying bombings, the pervasive fear. She wrote about their young son, who asked the same question every single night before he went to sleep: "Will Daddy come home before the war ends?" Edmund folded the letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly, and stared at it for a long, silent time. He couldn't bring himself to write back the full truth. He couldn't tell her that when he finally did come home, the Britain he returned to would not be the same country he had left behind. Its power, its wealth, its place in the world, it was all being signed away, piece by piece, 3,000 miles across the ocean. Then came 1945. Victory. The war was over. Crowds poured into the streets of London, a sea of cheering, singing people waving flags, overcome with relief and joy. The dominant belief, the desperate hope, was that everything would finally return to normal, that the Britain of 1939 would re-emerge from the rubble. But Edmund, who had seen the ledgers and signed the contracts, knew better. He saw the cold, hard numbers in the treasury accounts. Britain's empire hadn't just been challenged, it had been mortally wounded. The national treasury was empty, a cavernous void where a fortune once sat. The colonies, from India to Kenya, were restless, their loyalties fractured, their eyes turning towards a new global power. And America, once a debtor nation itself, was now the creditor to the entire world. The final, bitter pill came shortly after the celebrations died down. The war was won, but the accounting had just begun. The United States sent Britain a bill, not for the Lend-Lease supplies used and destroyed in the fight against Nazism, but for all the surviving equipment: the trucks, the planes, the ships that were not sunk or shot down. The bill was so massive, the debt so staggering, that it would take Britain more than 60 years to pay it off. The final payment was made in the year 2006. Sometime after the war, Edmund stood on the deck of a ship, making the long journey back to Britain. He watched the gray, moody clouds of the North Atlantic roll across the horizon. A colleague, standing beside him in silence, finally broke it, his voice a near whisper. "We won the war," he said, "but we lost the world." Edmund didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was laid bare in the cold ocean air. Germany had threatened Britain's land, its homes, its very existence. But it was America that had taken Britain's empire. It had happened quietly, legally, and permanently. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden chapters of history.